Nothing in the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses changes randomly. Every visual detail, every color choice, every facial expression, every character represented in their publications is carefully calculated to transmit a message without needing to write a single word. And now, in 2026, a new aesthetic has emerged, subtle to some, glaring to others, revealing that the organization is undergoing its largest visual overhaul since the 1970s. Today we're going to uncover what these changes are meant to communicate, why they're happening now, and what psychological game is being played behind this new image. Let me show you something that will make everything clear. In this image from their latest publications, we see a scene that would have been absolutely unthinkable just 5 years ago. At the center of the frame stands a woman wearing orange dress pants and a matching blazer. Her posture is confident, her presence commanding. She's not hidden in the background. She's not diminished or made secondary. She is literally the focal point of this carefully composed photograph. And if you've been around Jehovah's Witnesses for any length of time, you know exactly why this is shocking. For decades, the idea of a woman wearing pants to a Kingdom Hall meeting was considered inappropriate at best and scandalous at worst. Women in pants were viewed as masculine, lacking in Christian decorum, failing to demonstrate proper submission to biblical gender roles. Now, technically, pants were never officially prohibited. You won't find a direct statement in Watchtower literature saying women cannot wear pants. But anyone who grew up in this organization knows the reality. The unofficial rules were far more powerful than anything written in print. Elders would give counsel. Pioneers would gossip. Parents would pressure their daughters. The message was crystal clear even if it was never explicitly stated. Faithful sisters wear dresses and skirts to meetings, period. So why does a woman in pants now appear as the protagonist of an official Watchtower illustration? What does this sudden shift signify? The organization wants to signal flexibility. They want to appear contemporary, accessible, modern. They desperately need to dissociate themselves from the image of rigidity, patriarchy, and extreme formalism that has increasingly made them look like a relic from another century. This is a calculated move to tell the world, and more importantly to tell their own members, that they're not as backwards as people think they are. But here's where the psychology gets fascinating. This image is specifically designed to send a message to women in the organization. It's telling them that they are part of this new phase, that they can relax a little, that they can express themselves more freely. It's an invitation to feel less constrained, less judged, less suffocated by endless rules about appearance. And for women who have spent years feeling like they were walking on eggshells, constantly worried about whether their skirt was long enough or their neckline modest enough, this visual message carries enormous emotional weight. But here's the critical question. Has the actual doctrine changed? Has there been any shift in the organization's teachings about women's roles, women's authority, women's submission to male leadership? Absolutely not. The doctrine remains exactly the same. Women still cannot give talks from the main platform. Women still cannot serve as elders or ministerial servants. Women still must wear head coverings if they pray in the presence of a baptized male. Women are still taught that their primary purpose is to support their husbands and raise children in the truth. Nothing fundamental has changed. Only the packaging has been updated. Now look at the men in this photograph. Several of them have beards. Full, well-groomed beards that would have instantly marked them as spiritually weak or even rebellious just a few years ago. The beard issue in the Jehovah's Witnesses organization has always been one of the most absurd and yet most revealing aspects of their control mechanisms. For generations, the Watchtower Society associated beards with rebellion, worldliness, and lack of submission. The reasoning was never quite coherent. After all, Jesus had a beard. The apostles had beards. The patriarchs had beards. Every illustration in Watchtower publications showing faithful men from ancient times depicted them with beards. But modern witnesses were strongly discouraged from having beards, especially if they wanted privileges in the congregation. If you wanted to serve as a ministerial servant, you shaved. If you wanted to be an elder, you shaved. If you wanted to pioneer, you shaved. If you wanted to give talks at conventions, you definitely shaved. The unwritten rule was absolute. A clean-shaven face demonstrated submission to organizational guidance. A beard demonstrated independence, pride, and a troubling tendency to think for yourself. The enforcement of this rule was never consistent or logical. In some countries, particularly in Europe and parts of Latin America, beards were more accepted. In others, particularly in the United States, they were virtually forbidden. This inconsistency only highlighted the arbitrary nature of the restriction. It wasn't about biblical principle. It was about conformity. It was about control. It was about ensuring that every member looked like they belonged to the same homogeneous group. And now, suddenly, the same organization that pressured generations of men to scrape their faces every morning appears in official publications with young men and older men sporting prominent beards. No announcement was made. No article explained the change. No apology was offered to the countless brothers who were denied privileges because of facial hair. The shift just happened, quietly, through visual messaging in their illustrations and videos. What does this reveal about the organization's current strategy? The leadership has realized that the old image of standardized, identical-looking men simply doesn't attract anyone anymore. A religious organization that wants to survive in the 21st century needs to appear current, needs to look like it belongs in the modern world. And in contemporary culture, beards have become symbols of authenticity, maturity, and individuality. By allowing beards to appear in their visual materials, the organization is attempting to capture younger men, transmit freshness, and suggest that they're not as rigid as their reputation indicates. But notice the psychological manipulation at play here. They're not admitting they changed. They're not acknowledging they were wrong for decades. They're not apologizing for the harm they caused to men who were marginalized because of arbitrary grooming standards. They're simply illustrating things differently now and expecting everyone to adapt without question. This is how authoritarian systems operate. Rules change without explanation. Members are expected to keep up and accept the new normal without pointing out the contradictions. Now let's examine another seemingly minor detail that carries enormous significance. In this image, several men appear without ties. This might not seem important to someone outside the organization, but within the structure of Jehovah's Witnesses, the absence of a tie at a meeting is loaded with meaning. For decades, wearing a tie was one of the most basic requirements for men at Kingdom Hall meetings. It wasn't just about looking neat or professional. The tie was a symbol of respect for Jehovah, respect for the congregation, and respect for the spiritual food being provided. A man who showed up to a meeting without a tie would be viewed as spiritually negligent, disrespectful, or possibly even materialistic if he owned suits but refused to wear them properly. But look carefully at this image. The younger men in the foreground are dressed casually. One wears just a dress shirt without a tie. Another wears a simple sweater. Meanwhile, the older men in the background are still wearing complete suits with ties, maintaining the traditional formal standard. This isn't accidental. This deliberate contrast creates a visual narrative about generational transition within the organization. It communicates that the new generation is permitted a level of casualness that would have been unthinkable for previous generations. At the same time, it reassures the older generation that their way of doing things is still valued, still visible, still part of the organization's identity. This is a masterclass in psychological messaging. The organization is attempting to hold two completely different audiences at the same time. To younger people, the message is clear. You can come as you are, we accept you, you don't have to conform to outdated standards of formality that mean nothing to your generation. But to older members, the message is equally clear. Your way is still here, we haven't abandoned everything you believe in, we're not pushing you out. By showing both standards coexisting in the same space, the organization creates a sense of inclusivity while actually managing a controlled transition from one cultural paradigm to another. This brings us to perhaps the most shocking element in this photograph. Look at the young man in the green sweater. He's holding a smartphone. Not just holding it casually at his side, but actively using it during the meeting. This is absolutely extraordinary. For decades, the cell phone was treated as the enemy of spirituality within the Jehovah's Witnesses organization. Phones were viewed as distractions from spiritual things, portals to the corrupt world outside, threats to focus and devotion. Members were repeatedly counseled to turn off their phones during meetings, to avoid checking them, to resist the temptation to engage with worldly content when they should be focused on kingdom interests. The paranoia around phones was particularly intense when it came to internet access. Elders warned about the dangers of social media, the threats posed by apostate websites, the spiritual poison available at the touch of a screen. Young people especially were told to be extremely cautious about their phone usage, to avoid worldly friendships online, to stay away from anything that might expose them to ideas that contradicted Watchtower teaching. The underlying message was clear. Your phone is dangerous, the digital world is dangerous, and you need to keep both at arm's length if you want to stay spiritually strong. And yet here, in an official Watchtower illustration from 2026, we see a young person with a phone in their hand during a congregation meeting. Not hiding it. Not being discreet. Just naturally holding it as part of their participation in the gathering. What has changed? The organization has finally understood what should have been obvious years ago. The digital world has won. Information is outside their control. Young people live constantly connected. And rigid prohibitions do more to drive members away than to protect them from spiritual danger. By normalizing the presence of phones in this illustration, the organization is attempting to update its image and reduce the perception of isolation and control. The visual message being sent is that you can be part of this organization without abandoning your digital tools, without disconnecting from modern life, without becoming the kind of weird, isolated person that outsiders often assume Jehovah's Witnesses are. It's an invitation designed to lower barriers and make membership seem less demanding, less alienating, less cultish. But we need to be clear about what hasn't changed. The organization still monitors online activity. Elders still counsel members about what they post on social media. Members are still discouraged from looking at critical information about the organization. People are still disfellowshipped for expressing doubts online or connecting with former members through digital platforms. The fundamental control mechanisms are all still in place. What's changed is simply the visual messaging, the surface-level presentation designed to make the organization appear more normal and less restrictive than it actually is. Now let's step back and look at the bigger picture that emerges from this single image. What we're seeing is the coexistence of two completely different worlds within one organization. On one side, we have the modernized young people, men with beards, women in pants, casual clothing, vibrant colors, smartphones in hand. On the other side, we have the traditional older members, men in complete suits and ties, women in conservative dresses, formal postures, adherence to decades-old standards of appearance and behavior. This is the most important psychological clue in the entire photograph. The organization is desperately trying to keep both audiences alive simultaneously. They cannot afford to lose their base of elderly faithful members who donate money, volunteer labor, and provide institutional stability. These are the people who pioneered for decades, who built kingdom halls with their own hands, who gave up careers and education to serve organizational interests. They are absolutely essential to the organization's current functioning. But at the same time, the organization knows that without young people, they have no future. The old guard is literally dying off. Birth rates among witnesses have dropped. Conversion rates have stagnated. And most critically, young people are leaving in unprecedented numbers. They're walking away before baptism, fading after baptism, or openly disassociating themselves and speaking out about their experiences. The organization is hemorrhaging its future, and the leadership knows it. So this image functions as a visual bridge between two universes that rarely meet within rigid hierarchical structures. It's an attempt to create a space where both the traditional and the modern can coexist, where neither group feels completely alienated or abandoned. But this is an incredibly fragile balance to maintain. How long can you present two different versions of acceptability before one group or the other realizes they're being manipulated? How long can you avoid making definitive statements about what's actually allowed before the contradictions become impossible to ignore? Let's talk about what the organization is preparing for in 2026 and beyond. The Jehovah's Witnesses have spent recent years in a position they've never quite experienced before: stagnation. For decades, they were one of the fastest-growing religious movements in the world. Their annual reports celebrated constant increases in publishers, pioneers, and baptisms. Growth was presented as evidence of divine blessing, proof that Jehovah was speeding up the preaching work in these last days. But that growth has largely stopped. In many developed countries, numbers have flatlined or even declined. Congregations are merging. Kingdom halls are being sold. The organization has had to acknowledge financial difficulties and ask for more donations. Meanwhile, the Internet has brought an explosion of critical information about the organization. Documentaries expose their child abuse scandals. Podcasts feature former members sharing their stories. Websites catalog false prophecies and doctrinal contradictions. YouTube channels like yours investigate their history and practices. For the first time in their modern history, the Watchtower Society is facing a genuine crisis of credibility and sustainability. 2026 marks a new editorial phase in their visual communication strategy. And everything we're seeing in these new images indicates that the organization is preparing a major rebranding effort. They're attempting to present themselves as more tolerant without actually changing any doctrine. They're crafting a younger aesthetic to combat the exodus of new members. They're visually softening their rigid image to appear less sectarian and more normal. They're repositioning themselves publicly to distance themselves from the reputation of being a controlling, closed, cultish group. This is fundamentally a survival strategy. The demographics are working against them. The economics are working against them. The information environment is working against them. They cannot continue operating the same way they did in the 20th century and expect to exist in the 22nd century. Something has to change. But here's the crucial point. They're not willing to change the things that actually matter. They're not willing to abandon shunning practices that destroy families. They're not willing to reform their child abuse policies to prioritize victims over organizational reputation. They're not willing to allow freedom of conscience on doctrinal matters. They're not willing to give up the authoritarian control that defines their entire structure. So instead, they're changing the wrapping paper while keeping the same package inside. 2026 will be the year they try to look like a different religion without actually being a different religion. They'll update their aesthetic, modernize their visual messaging, soften their public presentation, and hope that surface-level changes are enough to stop the bleeding. And the tragedy is that it might work, at least temporarily, because most people judge organizations by appearances rather than by substance. Let me bring this investigation to its conclusion. The new aesthetic we're examining does not change any of the fundamental teachings or practices that define Jehovah's Witnesses as a high-control religious organization. Disfellowshipping and shunning continue exactly as before. Families are still torn apart when members leave. Social isolation of the expelled continues to be enforced. Absolute submission to organizational authority is still required. Obedience to the governing body is still presented as equivalent to obedience to God. Fear of Armageddon is still used to control behavior and suppress doubt. Distrust of former members labeled as apostates is still cultivated at every opportunity. The core is identical. What has changed is exclusively the packaging. And this is how the organization has always operated. They rarely make direct announcements about policy changes. They don't issue apologies for past mistakes. They don't openly acknowledge that they're shifting positions. Instead, they publish carefully crafted images. They produce videos with updated visual standards. They model new behaviors through their media without explaining what they're doing. And members absorb the messages, adjust their behavior accordingly, internalize the new expectations, and accept the changes without question. This is how you reconstruct a religion from the outside while maintaining the same control mechanisms on the inside. This is how you create the illusion of progress while preserving the substance of authoritarianism. This is how you manipulate perception while avoiding accountability for the manipulation. The images tell members what to think before any words need to be spoken. The visual narratives shape expectations before any official policies are announced. And by the time everyone has adapted to the new normal, the organization can act as if nothing significant ever changed at all. So as we look at this photograph from 2026, we're not just seeing people in a kingdom hall. We're seeing a sophisticated psychological operation designed to manage perception, control narratives, and ensure organizational survival in an increasingly hostile information environment. Every element has been chosen deliberately. Every detail serves a purpose. Nothing is accidental. And the message being sent is clear. We're changing just enough to seem relevant while changing nothing that actually matters. Welcome to the new Jehovah's Witnesses organization, where everything looks different but everything essential remains exactly the same.